David Gilmour isn't just a legend, he's the heart and soul of music itself, the man whose famous black guitar created the unforgettable prayer in Comfortably Numb and turned the sad notes of Shine on You Crazy Diamond into Forever Sorrow. He didn't just play music, he turned pain into sound, built amazing structures of sadness and beauty out of nothing, leaving the world with songs so haunting that millions still go quiet when they listen. For decades he was more than a musician, he was like a container holding human pain and greatness, a quiet storm whose guitar solos cut deeper than any words ever could. But that brilliance was written in blood and tears, the friend who felt terrible about having to leave Syd Barrett to his mental illness, the brother who was helpless watching Richard Wright die from a terrible disease, and the artist hurt by betrayal, bitterly pushed aside from the very band he once saved from falling apart. Those disasters could have destroyed anyone, yet he kept going, turning every wound into music that will last forever. And now at 79 years old, when the world thought he had finally found peace after endless storms, an unspoken darkness hangs over him, leaving millions shocked. What ghost still haunts the silent genius of Pink Floyd? Every legend is born not just from winning but from a wound too deep to heal. For David Gilmour, that wound began in silence, a silence so cruel it shaped every note he would ever play. It's heartbreaking to know that one of rock music's most beautiful voices grew not from happiness but from a home where thinking was more important than love and dinners passed without laughter. Born on March 6, 1946 in Cambridge, England, he was the son of Douglas, a zoologist and teacher at the university, and Sylvia, a teacher and later a film editor. To people outside, it looked like a good life, a stable middle-class home in Grantchester, books on every shelf, conversations filled with smart talk. But to the boy sitting quietly at that table, it was something else completely, a forgotten empty space. Years later Gilmour himself described it in those exact words, remembering not chaos or being poor but a kind of not caring that cut deeper than any hit. A silence that left scars you couldn't see but that lasted forever. He had brothers and sisters yet belonging always slipped away, and in the quiet rooms of his childhood nobody truly listened. At just 10 years old his mother put a guitar in his hands, never knowing she had just changed music history forever. With no teacher and no help, he disappeared into his room under the light of a lamp, a boy hunched over strings while the crackling of a radio filled the night. Each riff repeated endlessly wasn't practice, it was survival, the only language he had in a house that never spoke to him. While other children shouted in playgrounds, David carved emotion into sound, bending strings until they cried. By 13 years old, shadows pressed harder on his young mind and he was already thinking about death, haunted by how short life could be. At the Perse School in Cambridge, while classmates played and argued, David often pulled away, not interested in grades or social groups. Later at the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, fate placed him near Syd Barrett and Roger Waters, fellow students whose names would one day join with his in legend. But in those years his world stayed smaller and lonelier, tied to the guitar that had become his safe place. Those long lonely hours became seeds of music that would one day make entire stadiums go completely silent. This wasn't a childhood of broken glass or stormy fights but something far more harmful, a quiet so cruel it pressed down on the soul. Yet within that stillness he built strength, he learned to pull beauty from emptiness, to bend a single note until it carried more pain than words, to turn loneliness into a cathedral of sound. The boy nobody quite heard became the man whose guitar could silence an ocean of voices. The silence didn't break him, he broke the silence, and from it he gave the world some of the most hauntingly beautiful music ever known. Every journey worth telling begins not in winning but in struggle, and David Gilmour's path began with hunger. In the early 1960s, while his old schoolmates Syd Barrett and Roger Waters were making their names in London's psychedelic underground music scene, David was barely getting by in small local bands like Joker's Wild, a gifted guitarist with extraordinary touch but no stage to call his own. He and his friends drifted to France chasing the dream of music across a continent, but the road was cruel. Guitars went missing, amplifiers were stolen, money disappeared. There were nights when the only choice was unthinkable: sell the very instrument that carried his soul just to buy bread. In Paris, in roadside cafes, on cobblestone streets where tourists passed without listening, David played guitar for coins, living not on applause but on survival. To the world Pink Floyd was rising, to David, Europe was a long road of empty stomachs and rough fingers, a lesson in how cruel fate could be to those left behind. When he finally returned to London it was with nothing, no equipment, no band, only a determination that somehow refused to die. And then came the shock that cut deeper than hunger. Visiting a studio where Pink Floyd was recording, he saw Syd Barrett again, the boy he had once played music with on Cambridge streets, now leading one of Britain's most talked-about bands. But it wasn't the same Sid. His eyes were glazed, his speech broken, his movements strange. The spark of genius that had once seemed unstoppable was now broken by years of heavy drug use and the beginning of severe mental illness, what doctors would later recognize as schizophrenia-like symptoms. He looked at David and barely seemed to know him. The friend who had once painted sound in colors nobody else could imagine was dissolving right before his eyes, his mind slipping beyond reach. David stood there not just as a friend, but as someone watching the collapse of brilliance. It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was terrifying. The boy he once admired had become a stranger, and the band Sid had built stood on the edge of ruin. In 1967, fate twisted again. Pink Floyd asked Gilmour to join, not as a replacement but as an emergency backup, a fifth member meant to cover when Sid could no longer perform. For a few strange shows there were 5 men on stage. For playing, 1 drifting in silence. David remembered turning to see Sid with his guitar hanging loose around his neck, eyes empty, not moving, as if the spotlight itself had turned him to stone. It was unbearable. Soon the decision was made in quiet cruelty. On the way to a show they simply stopped picking Sid up. That night David Gilmour became the lead guitarist of Pink Floyd. To the fans he was the man who had stepped into a legend's shoes. To David himself he was the man who had just abandoned his friend to madness. He carried that wound forever. But being in Pink Floyd didn't end the struggle. The band was drifting without their founding visionary. On stage David sometimes played with his back to the audience, overwhelmed, unsure if the music still made sense. Their first album without Sid, A Saucerful of Secrets in 1968, was less a statement than a survival move. They had to keep moving, to keep playing, or the dream would die completely. They turned to film soundtracks like More in 1969 and Obscured by Clouds in 1972, not glamorous work but a lifeline. Studios would pay them and they could experiment under the cover of someone else's project. In these sessions David sharpened his guitar voice, the long delay, the aching bends, the infinite sustain that would become his signature. Then from this fog of uncertainty something miraculous came out. In 1971 they recorded Metal and its centerpiece Echoes, a 23-minute epic that filled an entire side of vinyl. It was the sound of 4 men finally breathing as one, creating a new identity from chaos. The opening ping of Gilmour's guitar cut through like a lighthouse in darkness, and by the end the music swelled into a vast wordless ocean. For the first time since Sid, Pink Floyd had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was David's guitar. It had been a journey of hunger and guilt, of being left behind and then thrust unwillingly into the spotlight. He had walked the streets of Europe broke and invisible. He had watched a friend vanish into madness. He had felt the shame of taking his place and the cold terror of facing audiences with no map, no leader, no certainty. Yet through all of it David Gilmour kept going. He turned hunger into strength, guilt into compassion, uncertainty into sound, and from those years of struggle came the voice of his guitar, the voice that would one day silence stadiums and outlive even the darkest shadows.